Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you to all of you for inviting me here today. It's a great pleasure to be with the ADF. I feel like I'm a bit out of my league. The ADF is sort of the Kevin Bacon of civil liberties organizations. If you look at all the major cases in the last decade, none of them are more than 1 degree away from the ADF, at least if it's a victory. Those cases, of course, include Masterpiece Cake Shop, all the way through Dobbs, and of course my favorite case, 303 Creative, which I consider one of the most important free speech cases in the history of the Supreme Court. I've been asked to talk about 800 years of free speech in 30 minutes. And so as Henry VIII told Anne Boleyn, "Fear not, I shall not keep you long." I'm here really to talk about my new book, which took 30 years in the making, so I get about a minute a year. The reason I couldn't let this book go is that I didn't want to write just another free speech book. I wanted to try to understand why we're still wrestling with free speech after so long as a republic. And the problem is that we often deal with free speech in terms of the insular conflicts that arise in a school, in a bakery. And we don't resolve really what free speech is. And this book looks at that and comes to perhaps a controversial conclusion, certainly for many of my colleagues in the legal academy. But the subtitle of the book is Free Speech in an Age of Rage, not the Age of Rage. And the reason is that this is not our first. Rage has been part of our politics since the founding. The Boston Tea Party was an act of rage. Rage is an odd thing that I talk about in the book. It gives us a license. It allows us to say things that we would not ordinarily say or do. It's all around us. This is one of those ages of rage. And it's liberating, and it's contagious, and it's addictive. When I was covering the trial for President Trump in New York, and I came out of the courtroom after his conviction, there were people dancing in the street. It was like a rage fest. None of them would admit it, that they liked it. They needed it. But it's really not the rage rhetoric that is the problem. The problem is what I call state rage. It's when the government uses rage rhetoric to unleash censorship, prosecutions on others. And this age of rage is more serious than any in our history, as I talk about in the book. Because we've never in the free speech community seen a coalition like the one we have seen in the last 10 years. A coalition of the government, the press, academia, corporations, all joined together to create a censorship system for disinformation, misinformation, malinformation. And that has created a generation of speech phobics. We've taught our children that they have to be afraid of free speech, that it's not the thing that defines us, but the thing that will destroy them. When my book came out, 4 books by law professors came out with it. All 4 of those other books were anti-free speech. One by a University of Michigan law professor, who's also the legal analyst for MSNBC, said that free speech is the Achilles heel of the United States and it would destroy us. The principal title of the book is actually taken from an opinion by Louis Brandeis called Whitney. And the reason I included it, I'm not sure Simon Schuster was thrilled with the title, quite frankly, but the reason I included it is that I wanted people to think about this interesting conflict, that Louis Brandeis was arguably the most brilliant member the Supreme Court has ever had. We can argue about that, but he was certainly one of the great civil libertarians. And he wrote a beautiful opinion in Whitney and called free speech an indispensable right, a right upon which all other rights depend. You can't have freedom of religion, association, the press, without freedom of speech. That's why 303 Creative was so important, because I'd been arguing for years that the way to resolve these religious conflicts is not with necessarily the religious clause as much as the free speech clause. And 303 Creative created a brilliant, bright line with the help of the ADF. And so part of the onus of the book was to understand how Louis Brandeis could write these beautiful poetic words and then at the end say, I concur. He was concurring with the upholding of a conviction of Charlotte Anita Whitney, who was convicted of speaking against lynchings. How could such a great civil libertarian sign off on such a gross injustice and a deprivation of free speech? The fact is that it's easy if you adopt the functionalist approach to free speech, which the book criticizes. It is the approach that most law professors teach. It's the approach that most courts follow. It goes something like this, that we protect free speech because it's essential for democracy. It has a function that makes democracy better. And it certainly does that, but it's much, much more than that. The problem with the functionalist approach to free speech is if you say you protect free speech because of its function, then it allows you not to protect free speech that is not good for democracy. It allows you to say that some speech is good speech and some speech is bad speech. And that's the slippery slope that we have been on for centuries. We had a moment of clarity at the start of our republic. The most revolutionary part of the American Revolution was what they said in the First Amendment. Most of the U.S. Constitution comes from the English tradition. The framers liked the English legal system overall. They just didn't like what it did. But the one thing that didn't come in any part from Great Britain was the protection of free speech. Great Britain didn't protect free speech. It still doesn't. Magna Carta didn't protect free speech. It was bizarre. Years ago, I was asked to speak at the big 800 celebration of the anniversary of Magna Carta, which was odd because they didn't actually look at my writings because I was a critic of Magna Carta, which made it odd. But it actually doesn't even talk about free speech. That gets to the more controversial part of this book. The moment of clarity that we had, the most revolutionary moment that we had, was not only what we said about free speech, but why we said it. The framers, in my view, believed that free speech was guaranteed to us by natural law, that it was a gift from God. Now, part of that was a strong belief in John Locke. John Locke was interesting in his work on the foundations for civilization, and he said that in the state of nature, before we developed society, there were rights. Before the existence of government, there were rights. Those rights came from God, came through the act of creation. Free speech is one of those rights. The freedom of thought, as he referred to it. So then, what is free speech? When I teach free speech in class, I show this picture, which you will recognize very likely as the center panel from the Sistine Chapel. It's a beautiful painting. It's entitled, God Creates Adam. I ask my students, what does this mean? And specifically, what does that mean? Now, more people have gotten a PhD off this picture than any picture in history. Most people say, look, that's the act of creation, which is a bit odd, because Adam seems fully formed already. The question I ask my students is, what if it's more than that? What if God creates Adam is more than that? After all, we are told that God created man in his image. What is God? Well, God is a creator. What if the touch meant something more? That what makes us in the image of the Creator is that we are also creators. You know, it's interesting that years ago, I came across an article in this just minor publication that intrigued me because it was a doctor, a neurologist who was on vacation with his wife, went to Sistine Chapel, looked up there. They were walking out. As many of you know, they sort of give you the bum's rush after 15 minutes. So he's leaving, and then he stops. And he turns and said, "Did you see what I saw?" And she said, "What?" And he says, "Come back." And he said, "That. What's behind God is the human brain." He said it's the exact outline of the human brain. Not close, it's the exact outline of the human brain. Why would Michelangelo do that? It's not just some French curve, as they say. It's the exact outline of the human brain. Well, of course, Michelangelo knew what the human brain looked like because he would dissect bodies. I don't know. But what if that was intentional? What could it possibly mean? One could say, this was sort of a secular idea, sticking a finger in the eye of the Pope. Maybe it's not that. Maybe what is divine about human beings, being created in God's image, is that we are also creators. The fact is that we have an insatiable desire to create. When I teach the First Amendment, I walk around the class until I find a student doodling. It doesn't take very long. And I stop and I say, "Are you doodling?" And they freak. And they go, no, I was listening. I said, no, I like doodling. Everyone doodles. People doodle at weddings and funerals. They doodle in boats with goats. They doodle all the time. The question is why? Most of us doodle and we create these weird geometric shapes and they get more and more dense until they're just an ink blot. We don't even know what we're doodling, but we doodle. We seem to have an insatiable desire. We're hardwired to create. It's not just like the Great Wall of China or the Sistine Chapel. It's found in doodles. It's found in everything we do. It's found in a starving artist. The image of a starving artist is true. Van Gogh was starving, not metaphorically starving, actually starving. And someone came and gave him a few coins to eat. And he went out and bought more canvas and paint with it. Now, survival is the thing that supposedly defines all human beings, and yet he bought canvas and paint with it. What if Michelangelo was really saying that the divinity is found in what we got from God, a desire to create? We're hardwired for it. There's parts of the human brain that actually shrink if we are not allowed to express ourselves, to project part of ourselves in the world around us. So what defines human beings? We can't define what free speech is until we figure out what we are. Now, we can look at things like DNA, but it's not very helpful. We have an over 98% overlap with giant apes. We have a 65% overlap with fruit flies. And we have a 60% overlap with that. Now, does that make us talking bananas? Sort of bananas 2.0? So obviously our DNA doesn't define us. What then defines a human being? And the fact is we've learned that what defines human beings is what makes us truly human, is that divine touch. We learned it from people like Phineas Gage, who was a railroad tapper in Vermont, and he had an accident. His job was to set explosives, tamp it down with that iron, that very iron, until he made a mistake one day and blew it through his head. That iron. went through below his chin, out the top of his head. The doctor involved was a brilliant doctor named Mayhew. He didn't exactly rush to the scene. He was told that someone had an iron blown through his head, so he didn't rush. And he was shocked when he found Phineas Gage sitting up, talking and making notes in his book. And then he had the most brilliant, his name was Harlow, he had the most brilliant epiphany of perhaps any doctor in history. He realized that we had no idea what the front part of the brain does. But he knew that he didn't have one, at least not a complete one. And he figured that if he could figure out what he could do before and what he cannot do now, it would probably tell us what the front part of the brain does. And what he was surprised is that he could do everything. He could function, eat, walk, talk. The only change was expressed by his friends over and over again using the same word. He became an animal. He couldn't experience love. He couldn't engage in abstract concepts like relationships. And he was quick to anger. And if he didn't get what he wanted, he would take it. And it makes sense, because the front part of the brain is where we form abstract ideas, whether about relationship or art. We need free speech to be fully human. That brings us back to Whitney. Whitney was a very courageous woman. She's one of the first communists in the United States. There, I think she made a mistake. But she made it for the right reason. When she comes from one of the most privileged families in the United States. Her family goes back to 4 families on the Mayflower, which, when you think about it, is an extraordinary level of inbreeding. Now, she was a privileged woman who grew up. She was the niece of Justice Fields, longest-standing justice, one of the longest-standing justices on the Supreme Court. Spent every summer with them. And on a trip from Wellesley College, they went on a field trip. It was supposed to be just a day to a settlement house on Rivington Street. She stayed 4 weeks. She'd never seen such poverty, such suffering. She wanted to do something about it. She fought for women's right to vote in California. And she was told if she spoke again against lynchings, she'd be arrested. And this courageous woman went on that stage and she gave exactly that speech. And it went to in front of the greatest 2 civil libertarians of the age, Louis Brandeis, Oliver Wendell Holmes. And they sent her to jail. They couldn't get off that slippery slope. The fact is, the revolutionary part of our republic are those words. They seem to come out of the head of Zeus. No one has used those words before or after. Even the Marquis de Lafayette, after the American Revolution, tried to put this in the rights of man. But instead of putting a period at the end, he put a comma and said, as long as it doesn't violate national laws. It sort of defeats the purpose. It's still revolutionary. One of my colleagues is leading a movement to amend the First Amendment, which she has said is aggressively individualistic, and it's a popular movement among law professors. She wants the free speech to be balanced against notions like equity. Some people understood it, though. Hugo Black said, I take no law abridging to mean no law abridging. And I think he was right. But we lost that moment of clarity. Madison wrote in 1800 an absolutely fantastic essay that was an implied criticism of John Adams and his use of the Alien and Sedition Acts to arrest his opponents. And there was a word he used in the middle of this essay. He called sedition prosecutions a monster. And he was right. We still prosecute people for sedition. We prosecuted a handful on January 6th. My book argues that we need to get rid of the crime of sedition. We need to break our sedition addiction. We need to do what Madison wanted to do. But John Adams became a hypocrite, perhaps the greatest in the American presidency. Jefferson was better. He pardoned everyone convicted under Adams, but after all, they were all Jeffersonians. And then he did prosecute some people for sedition. And ever since then, we've had our ages of rage. And we release this monster. When we're really afraid or we're really angry, we release it on our neighbors. Now, the book talks about this painting. When we were going to World War II, I'm a big fan of Norman Rockwell, and Rockwell decided that he was going to paint the four freedoms that FDR was talking about, and he started with free speech. When he finally produced the painting, I think some people at the White House were like, "What's that?" We sort of expected Washington crossing the Delaware. Who's that? And he said, "That's Jim Egerton, my neighbor." See, Rockwell had gone to a meeting in Vermont, and they were going to build a new school, and everyone was thrilled. Until Jim Egerton, who was actually the great-great-grandson of a revolutionary hero, but he was just a dairy farmer. And he stood up and he said, a simple question: how are we going to pay for it? He said, "I'm a dairy farmer and I'm not going to make it to the end of the year. There's dairy farmers here. We can't sell our milk. We can't support our cows. How are we going to pay for it? I don't want to lose my farm. I want a school. Just tell me how we're going to pay for it." Rockwell was so impressed. It's perhaps the meaning of free speech, truly. It's easy to use free speech against people you hate. It's sometimes harder with people you like, your neighbors. The interesting thing is that the White House might not have gotten it, but the American people did. That became the most popular war bonds poster in World War II. The American people got it immediately. They had no idea who Jim Egerton was. Didn't matter. They knew exactly what that painting meant, which is exactly why Rockwell was so popular and so profound. But that was not something that everyone agreed upon. Critics were turning on him. This was the beginning of abstract art movement. His fiercest critic was Emmett Greenberg, who wrote for the New Yorker and discovered the abstract painter Jackson Pollock. And every week, Greenberg would slam Rockwell. He said that this is an artist who's chosen not to be taken seriously. He said, "This is kitsch. It's not art. Jackson Pollock is art. This is not that." Every week, Rockwell never replied. He never did. Until he did. He probably gave the most devastating rebuttal in the history of the world. He painted that. Now, it's a huge painting called The Connoisseur. And it's an abstract painting. And it's one of the few Rockwell paintings where you can't see the face of the central figure. All you can see is his tense back. He seems an affluent person. He's obviously been there a while. He has the art catalog gripped tightly in his hands. And he seems, without seeing his face, to be searching for meaning. Now, when they unveiled this in the audience, by happenstance, was de Kooning, who was one of the most famous abstract artists of his generation, and Greenberg. And de Kooning jumped up and said, "My God, that's better than Pollock." He was so enthralled, he got a magnifying glass and forced critics to go up and look at the painting and said, "This is one of the finest abstract paintings I've ever seen." Rockwell could do that. Rockwell went to the best art schools in the world. He actually has a huge portfolio of art that you wouldn't necessarily recognize as a Rockwell. They're all fantastic in different styles. He was truly one of the most gifted artists of his generation. But he didn't want to paint like that. I read an interview towards the end of his life. A young reporter asked him a question that I thought was so poignant. Rockwell didn't give that many interviews. And he simply asked, why do you paint like that? It seemed to just resonate with Rockwell, that question. And he said, when I went as a young artist through America, I would see things that other artists didn't see. Little things, little vignettes that I wanted to paint because they were profound and they were being missed. It wasn't that he was painting a cop at a counter with a young boy, an umpire yelling at a baseball player and his coach. Americans knew it wasn't just about that. It was about them. It was about who they were down to the bone. He wanted to paint that. Now, in the United States, we have our own connoisseurs, law professors who say, look, the First Amendment cannot be that simplistic. It's kitsch. They might even say Turley is someone who shouldn't be taken seriously. Maybe they're right. But I think American people, when they see the First Amendment, they also see something profound in those words. It's not simple. And we don't need translation of legal connoisseurs. The question then is, where do we go from here? Well, read the darn book. No. No, I'll tell you, they gave me breakfast. Actually, I got to tell you, the one of the ways that Simon Schuster got this book out of my hands is I cut it in half, truth be known. The second half is going to be published with the anniversary. They're holding it as their anniversary book for the Declaration of Independence. They're going to release it beginning of 2026 for the 250th anniversary of the Declaration. And it follows forward as to what democracy, what American democracy is, what it means. But when I gave a speech recently in Colorado, this woman came up and said, I read your book, The Indispensable Right, and I liked it. I was just wondering today, could you end on something positive? I said, I thought I did. She was like, meh. So I feel bad. I feel like Woody Allen. They once told Woody Allen, could you end a speech on a positive note? And Woody Allen said, you haven't seen my movies? I don't do positive. So he suggested that he would give them 2 negatives to make a positive. So that's what I'll do. The first negative is it's not working. I just got back from the Berlin Forum, the World Forum in Berlin, I should say. It's the most anti-free speech event I've ever been in. I was one of only 2 people from the free speech community. They were hot after Vance's speech. The EU is armed for bear. But I asked them, I told them, it's not working. You've been at this now. Look out in Germany. You have one of the greatest censorship systems in the world, and it's not working. Neo-Nazis, skinheads, are having a banner a year. But a recent poll showed that only 17% of Germans feel comfortable speaking their values in public. But it's not working. They're wrong about young people, too. Young people are showing greater sensitivity to free speech. The second negative, my time is running out, is that we're going to continue to hurt ourselves. We're going to continue to be rageful, hateful. It's like Pandora's box. It was actually a jar, not a box. Pandora was the first true femme fatale. She was created by Zeus because he was angry at humanity. Prometheus had given humanity fire. So he had Prometheus chained to the side of a mountain and had eagles pecking his liver out. But for humanity, he sent them her, Pandora. But he made her too human. She was not supposed to open the jar yet. But she was too human. We're always going to open the jar. That's what being human is. And everyone knows that what was released by Pandora is greed, envy, hatred, pain, hunger, poverty, war, death. But very few people list the last thing that came out of the jar and the one that Zeus wanted the least to be released. The last thing that came out of the jar was hope. That's what Zeus didn't want released. The fact is, yeah, we're going to do this to each other. But we have hope that we're better. Better perhaps than the people we are and what we do. We're better because we believe that we were created with a divine spark, something that makes us truly human, that makes us capable of being better than we are. Thank you very much.